They said his birth was a miracle. They were wrong. It was a warning written in the veins of kings. For 2 centuries, Spain's royal blood had circled upon itself, uncle to niece, cousin to cousin, a golden loop tightening around the throne, until it strangled the empire from within. And from that dying blood came a boy, Charles, the last Habsburg-born weak, crowned early, cursed by ancestry, and bound to a fate no priest could bless. They called him El Hechizado, the Bewitched King, and when the church commanded him to marry his niece, the curse finally came to collect its crown. He was born beneath a blood-red dawn in a chamber thick with incense and silence. Madrid held its breath, for the queen had given birth at last, and yet no cry came from the cradle. The midwives looked at one another, pale as the linen beneath their hands. The child moved barely. His chest fluttered like a dying moth. The priest whispered a prayer not of joy, but of fear. The dynasty of Spain, the proud golden Habsburg line, had built its empire on conquest, faith, and incest. For centuries, uncles had married nieces. Cousins had taken cousins, and the blood that once carried the strength of empires had turned against itself. Charles was the final result of that defiance against nature. His face was long, his jaw jutting forward like a broken crown. His tongue was swollen, his lips unable to form words that the court could understand. He could not walk until nearly 10. He could barely chew his food without help. Yet his eyes were too aware. They shimmered with something no child should carry, a heavy, unspoken knowing. Servants swore he would stare at the crucifix for hours without blinking, as if measuring his own pain against the Savior's. Doctors called him fragile. Priests called him chosen. But the people called him El Hechizado, the bewitched. They said witches had cursed his birth, that the devil himself had twisted his body to punish Spain for its sins. But the truth was crueler. The curse was no spell, no demon, no witch. It was his blood. The king, his father, was also his mother's uncle. His mother, Mariana of Austria, was a woman so devout that she saw disease as divine punishment. She believed her son's weakness was the will of God, a test she must bear, even as he choked on his own breath. The royal physicians tried everything: mercury for his skin, leeches for his fever, holy water for his madness. Nothing helped. Each cure carved another wound into the boy's body. In the cold stone halls of the Escorial Palace, Charles grew not in strength, but in superstition. The servants avoided his gaze. The priests carried relics to ward off whatever darkness clung to him. Even his toys were relics: small wooden saints instead of dolls, tiny crucifixes instead of horses. When the bells rang for vespers, he was carried to the chapel, wrapped in velvet and silence. There he would kneel, a small trembling figure before a gold altar, while his mother prayed beside him, her hands shaking not with love, but with fear. For every mother's fear is that her child might die. But Mariana feared something worse, that her son might live and rule. The boy learned early that his body belonged to God, but his soul belonged to the church. Every cough was an omen, every tremor a message. They said he was a miracle sustained by faith alone. But miracles are expensive, and Spain was running out of faith to spend. Outside the palace walls, the empire was collapsing under the weight of its own glory. Wars drained the treasury, plagues hollowed the cities, and the Inquisition burned anyone who dared whisper that God might be tired. Inside, the boy king watched flames from his window, thinking they were stars. He was not allowed to play, not allowed to ride, not allowed to touch the common air. Too delicate, said the physicians. Too sacred, said the priests. By the time he turned 10, he had known more exorcisms than lessons, more rosaries than words. The court hid him like a wound beneath royal silk. When his father died, the bells of Spain tolled for a king. But the sound that echoed through the palace was not mourning. It was dread. The child, barely alive, was now the ruler of the greatest empire on earth. Her kingdom that stretched from the silver mines of the New World to the deserts of North Africa now belonged to a boy who could not speak, could not stand without trembling, and could not look into a mirror without the reflection trembling back. The council swore loyalty to him that day. But even as they bowed, they saw the truth in his frail frame. The reign of Spain's Habsburgs was not beginning anew. It was ending, quietly, beautifully, and in slow, sacred decay. And somewhere deep inside that fragile child, something began to stir. Not strength, not hope, but defiance. A flicker in the dying candlelight, the final heartbeat of a cursed crown. Madrid's palace was a theater, and the boy on the throne its quiet tragedy. From the outside, Spain still gleamed. Cathedrals tall as mountains, armadas heavy with silver, and banners bearing the Habsburg sun. But within those marble walls, the empire's heart had already begun to rot. Charles sat beneath the canopy of state, his small hands trembling upon the orb and scepter. He blinked slowly, his gaze wandering between the saints painted on the ceiling. When courtiers spoke to him, he smiled, softly, uncertainly, as if trying to understand what kind of creature they expected him to be. He rarely spoke. When he did, his voice was childlike, broken by breath. "Am I blessed?" he once asked a priest. The man hesitated before answering. "Yes, Your Majesty, but blessings often hurt." And so his silence deepened. It became a language of its own, a soundless decree that rippled through the royal court. Every noble learned to whisper. Every servant learned to walk without echo. In the palace of the Bewitched King, even music dared not linger. The Queen Mother ruled in his stead, Mariana of Austria, widow, regent, and self-proclaimed guardian of divine order. She saw devils in every illness, witchcraft in every cough. When Charles's fever returned, she summoned priests from across the realm. They prayed in shifts, day and night. Candles melted into oceans of wax before the Virgin's statue. One monk claimed the king's weakness came from a hidden maleficio, a spell buried under the palace floor. They tore up tiles, scattered holy water, burned herbs until the smoke stung the eyes. Charles sat in his chair and watched, as if witnessing his own haunting. When he reached 15, his mother ordered him to fast for 40 days, to strengthen the spirit. By the end, his ribs showed like harp strings beneath the skin. He fainted before the altar, the host still clutched between his teeth. The courtiers began to murmur. The soldiers in Flanders whispered that Spain was ruled by ghosts. The peasants prayed for rain and got locusts instead. And somewhere beyond the sea, a storm gathered around a word they did not dare say aloud: degeneration. For the people, the king was sacred. For the church, he was proof that sin could live within royal blood. For his advisors, he was useful only as long as he obeyed. He obeyed, always. When he tried to issue a decree, his mother would correct the words. When he lifted a pen, a secretary guided his hand. When he smiled, the courtiers clapped as if joy were a miracle. But miracles are not kind. One night, the palace was struck by thunder. Charles awoke screaming. He said the angels were whispering too loudly. When the guards rushed in, they found him kneeling on the floor, blood seeping from his bitten lip, his gaze fixed on the crucifix. The next morning, his mother ordered another exorcism. The priests bound him with cords, read from the Book of Tobit, and demanded the devil name himself. Charles answered in a whisper, "Which one?" That frightened even the clergy. Afterward, they claimed success. The devil was gone, they said, but the boy remained the same, pale, trembling, half lost between prayer and delirium. In the following month, Spain's fields failed to yield. Ships sank, the treasury hollowed, and Mariana began to fear that her son's sickness was not confined to his body, but had infected the crown itself. By the time Charles turned 20, his hair had thinned, his teeth rotted, his speech faltered into stutters and sighs. Yet he still clutched a rosary wherever he went. He still prayed before every meal. He still kissed the hand of every priest. He believed, as his mother had taught him, that his suffering was the price of Spain's salvation. But the nobles saw something else entirely. They saw a throne slowly collapsing under its own curse, and in secret, they began to plot the next marriage, one that might purify the royal blood, a union not of love, but of calculation. A wife chosen not by his heart but by his name, and so they prepared another ceremony, not a coronation, a continuation of the curse, for the King of Spain was about to take a bride, and she would be his niece. There are weddings that sound like hymns. This was not one of them. Madrid dressed itself in red and gold that day, but the joy was thin, like paint over cracked stone. Everyone at court knew why the bells were ringing. Not for love, not for alliance, but for desperation. Spain's last Habsburg king was sick, barren, and tiring. The doctors would not say it plainly. The priests would not say it blasphemously. But the ministers said it in locked rooms. If the king does not beget an heir, Spain will be divided like a carcass. So they looked where Habsburgs always looked, inside their own blood. His bride was young, too young, Maria Anna. Pretty, well-bred, God-fearing, and bound to him by blood before she was bound to him by vows. She was his niece, a living symbol of the family's refusal to admit defeat to nature. They told her it was an honor. They always tell girls it is an honor. In the great hall, the chandeliers burned with 100 trembling candles. The scent of myrrh, hot wax, and perfume mingled in a heavy cloud. The courtiers stood in their finest silks, faces arranged into masks of celebration. But behind the fans and feathers, their eyes were sharp, measuring, will this marriage save us? Will this child, if there is a child, keep France away? Or is this the day Spain admits it is dying? Charles entered slowly, not with the stride of a warrior king, but with the careful, uncertain steps of a man who does not fully trust his own legs. His attendants hovered, ready to steady him if his body betrayed him in front of God and the world. He wore white and gold, colors of purity, as if the church still believed it could wash the bloodline clean by dressing it in light. The bride followed, young, soft-faced, eyes lowered. She had been told he was pious. She had not been told he coughed blood. She had been told he was chosen by God. She had not been told he could barely eat. They knelt. The priest raised his hands. The Latin rolled like distant thunder, and 2 branches of the same poisoned tree were bound together in the name of heaven. No one said aloud what everyone knew. This marriage was not to join families. It was to trap the royal blood inside a circle, to squeeze one more heir out of a lineage that should have been allowed to rest. When the vows were spoken, Charles looked at his bride with something like gratitude and something like apology. He had not chosen this either. He too was a prisoner of his surname. At the feast, musicians played. Nobles laughed a little too loudly. Wine flowed to cover the taste of dread. Foreign ambassadors watched like vultures, sending quiet dispatches back to Versailles, to Vienna, to Rome. The Spanish king is weaker than we feared. The bride is but a girl. The succession is uncertain. That night the door to the royal bedchamber closed. The kingdom held its breath. We will not linger on what happened there, not because it was scandalous, but because it was tragic. How can a man whose body has been at war with itself since birth fulfill the one task history demands of him? How can a boy raised on relics and exorcisms suddenly become a husband? Servants waited in the corridor, listening for laughter, for soft talk, for any sign that Spain would have an heir. They heard only coughing. By morning, the rumors began. The king was too weak. The king was bewitched again. The king's organs are not right. The king is paying for the sins of his fathers, the queen wept quietly. Not because she did not like him. He was gentle, almost childlike, never cruel. But because she understood now she had not married a man. She had married a nation's fear. The council redoubled its piety. More masses, More relics, more holy men from remote monasteries summoned to break the spell. They bathed the king in blessed water. They gave him potions of bull's testicles, oysters, and spices. They whispered that perhaps someone, some enemy, some witch, some jealous court, had cast an evil eye on the royal seed. No one spoke of genetics. No one spoke of centuries of uncle-to-niece weddings. No one dared say, this is what happens when power mates only with itself. To the people, the official story was simple. Their king was pious. Their queen was pure, and the devil was strong. But in the shadows, among the tapestries and confessionals, a darker truth grew. Spain had a king whose body was failing him, a queen who could not give him an heir, and a future that looked more like a funeral than a coronation. And somewhere, in a candlelit room, the mad king of Spain began to wonder if perhaps he really was bewitched. The bells of Madrid tolled again, this time not for a wedding, but for a ritual. The priests came dressed in black and gold, carrying relics older than the empire itself. They crossed the marble floors, whispering psalms meant to drive out demons. In the throne room, every candle burned blue, the kind of flame that looks alive. Charles sat slumped on his chair, skin pale as wax, eyes rimmed in red. His body trembled as though something inside him was trying to escape. For weeks he had been plagued by dreams, his ancestors rising from their tombs, their bones whispering his name. The court had seen it before, fits of fear, sudden laughter, long silences followed by screams. But this time it was different. He said voices told him his marriage had angered God, that his seed was cursed. And so Spain turned to the church. The priests began the exorcism at dawn. They tied holy ribbons around his wrists, pressed relics to his forehead, and poured salt on the floor in a circle. The air smelled of iron and incense. "Speak your name," one cried. Charles whispered, "Charles of Spain, servant of Christ." "Then who speaks through you?" He trembled, eyes wide, voice breaking into a whisper that chilled every man present. "Blood. Only blood." A silence fell so deep that even the candles seemed to shrink from it. They read louder, faster psalms, benedictions, commands for hours. When it was over, the king was unconscious, sweat streaking his gaunt cheeks. The priests declared the devil gone, but the palace was never the same. At night, servants claimed to see figures moving where no one walked. The queen's maids swore they heard the king talking to someone when alone, sometimes laughing, sometimes weeping. When asked who was there, he said, "My father, my mother, all of them." And they are angry. He ordered new masses each dawn. He fasted until his robes hung loose. The royal physicians bled him again and again, saying the body must be purified. Each cut left him weaker. When he fainted during council, they carried him to bed like a child. Spain's rulers ruled him. The nobles fought over his will before he had even written it. The empire stretched from the New World to Naples, but its heart was beating slower every day. The queen tried to console him, but he turned away. "You are part of the curse," he said once, tears streaking his face. "You are my niece. You carry their faces. You remind me that I should not have been born." Her silence became the last mercy he knew. They said another exorcism was planned in secret, a harsher one. The priests from Toledo brought bones of saints, oil of the martyrs, ashes of relics too holy to name. When they began the ritual, thunder cracked over Madrid. The candles blew out, and in the dark the king whispered, "Tell them the curse is older than I am. Tell them it began when we started to marry mirrors." The next morning he would not eat, would not speak. He simply sat by the window, staring at the horizon as if waiting for the end of Spain itself to arrive. The palace had always been full of paintings. Habsburgs in armor, Habsburgs in lacer, Habsburgs with the same long jaw and unreadable eyes. A family repeating itself across centuries, like a prayer said too often, until it lost its meaning. But in Charles's last years, the paintings began to feel alive. He would sit in the great gallery, wrapped in a cloak despite the heat, and stare at the faces of his ancestors, Philip II, Charles IV Ferdinand, Isabella, men and women who had ruled worlds, burned heresy, broken empires like bread. You all had heirs, he murmured once. A servant heard him. You all had sons. Why am I the one who must fail? No one answered, but the silence of the gallery was heavier than any voice. The Queen's ladies began to avoid that hall. They said at night the portraits sighed, that one of the kings turned his eyes to follow the young queen, that another frowned when the bewitched king limped past. Maybe it was only candlelight. Maybe it was only guilt. But in a palace built on caged blood, every shadow looks like a punishment. Charles's body weakened further. His hair fell out in clumps. His stomach refused food. At times he would vomit foam and dark water, then cry afterward, apologizing to the Virgin for rejecting heaven's mercy. The doctors, out of remedies, turned to superstition. They said someone had cursed him with food from a corpse. They said a sorceress had stolen his seed. They said a nun had bound him to death with a thread under the moon. They were running out of explanations, so they made new ones. A report was sent to the Inquisition, not about witches in the villages, but about witches in the royal palace. That was how desperate Spain had become. It was willing to accuse its own walls. So they brought in the exorcist from Valladolid, a man said to have cast devils from nuns and generals alike. He looked at the king, frail, swollen-tongued, eyes too large for the skull, and he did not see a demon. He saw a victim, Your Majesty, he said quietly. This is not sorcery. This is inheritance, but inheritance cannot be burned at the stake. So they looked elsewhere for blame. They blamed France. They blamed the Queen. They blamed old mistresses dead years ago. They even blamed the midwife who had delivered him, saying she must have whispered something over him in the cradle. All the while, Charles sat in his chambers, turning rosary beads with fingers that could barely grip. He began to ask more and more often, "Will I go to purgatory? Will God punish me for failing Spain? Will my fathers be angry?" His confessor reassured him, "You are a suffering king. You are like Job. God will receive you." But Charles had begun to suspect something terrible, that maybe he was purgatory, and Spain had been passing through him slowly, painfully, toward its own judgment. Outside the palace, the world smelled the weakness of Spain. France circled. Austria circled. England watched. Everyone waited for the last Habsburg candle to go out so they could divide the darkness. Inside, the Queen grew lonelier. Her husband could not love her as a man. Her husband could not give her a child. Her husband could barely see her without seeing his own failure. There were nights she wept alone, and the old guard outside her door pretended not to hear. There is nothing more heartbreaking than a young queen married to a dying empire. Then came the day Charles asked to see his own autopsy report before he died. "Tell me what they will. Find," he said to the physician. "Tell me how God wrote my curse." The man, terrified, told him part of the truth. "Your Majesty, your body is not as other men's. Your heart is small. Your lungs are weak. Your head is large. Your seed cannot give life." Charles closed his eyes. "So Spain dies with me," he whispered. "Not because God willed it, but because we would not stop marrying ourselves." For a long moment no one in the room dared breathe. From that day he moved slower, spoke softer, prayed longer. He had stopped trying to be healed. He had started trying to be forgiven. But the throne, the great, jeweled seat of Spain, no longer looked like a gift to him. It looked like a coffin that had been waiting for the last child of a stubborn dynasty to finally lie down. Maria Anna's life had been planned long before she had learned to write her own name. She was raised in Vienna's marble halls, taught to pray, to curtsy, to smile softly when men spoke of destiny. Her tutors told her she would marry a prince. None said the prince would be her uncle. When she first arrived in Madrid, the city greeted her with roses and silence. Behind the walls of the palace, courtiers stared as if she carried both hope and doom in her luggage. They whispered that she might save Spain, though no one explained how a 16-year-old girl could heal a dying empire. Her husband, the king, looked smaller than she had imagined. Not smaller in height, smaller in presence. He was pale, trembling, his eyes so gentle they almost seemed borrowed from a child. He tried to smile for her, but his lips shook. She curtsied, he bowed. That was their beginning. For months she tried to love him. She tried to find the man beneath the legend, beneath the pity. She brushed his hair when he was ill, read to him from Psalms, held his hand through the endless fasts. He thanked her softly, always calling her Niña, little girl, never wife. At night she prayed beside the bed for strength. Outside the chamber, the guards crossed themselves when the king coughed. Inside, the queen whispered into the darkness, "If he is bewitched, then let the curse take me too." The court adored her at first. She was young, modest, devout. They called her the Angel of Madrid. But angels are easy to love when they are quiet. When months passed and her belly stayed flat, admiration turned to scrutiny. "Perhaps the queen is barren," said one faction. "Perhaps the devil fears her virtue," said another. In truth, she was only lonely. The palace was colder than any monastery. Each day began with mass, ended with confession. Her confessor asked the same question: "Has the marriage been fulfilled?" And every time she lowered her eyes, the king's body betrayed him more each year. His hands trembled so violently, he could not lift the chalice at communion. Sometimes he mistook his wife for his mother and wept. Once he clutched her arm and said, "Do not let them bury me before I die." She promised she would not, though she had no power to keep such promises. The factions around her grew bolder. The Austrian courtiers whispered in her ear that she must protect Habsburg interests. The Spanish nobles, resentful of foreigners, whispered that she was Vienna's spy. Every glance became an accusation, every prayer a rumor. She stopped attending the feasts. She stopped opening letters. She stopped expecting the king to look at her as a woman. He no longer looked at anyone for long. Sometimes she heard him walking the corridors at night, barefoot, muttering the names of dead relatives as if reciting a litany. "Philip, Margaret, Isabella, Ferdinand." She followed once and found him before a portrait of Charles V, whispering, "I am sorry." Then he began to laugh, a small, frightened laugh that echoed until dawn. The queen wept, not because he was mad, but because he was still trying to be good. She had been married to a ghost, and yet that ghost still prayed for her soul. By the time she turned 20, Maria Anna understood her role completely. She was not a wife. She was an offering, placed on an altar built from centuries of pride. Her only rebellion was silence. She learned to answer questions with gentle nods, to smile when courtiers lied to her face, to endure when priests demanded more confessions. And in the quiet of her chamber, she began to hate the sound of the word duty. Because duty had turned her husband into a shadow, her faith into fear, and her youth into mourning. She once asked her lady-in-waiting, "When will Spain stop praying and start breathing?" The woman bowed and said, "When God allows, Majesty." But even God seemed tired of Spain's prayers. Each night the palace grew colder, each dawn a little quieter. The queen sat by the window and watched the sky lighten over the city. A city that did not know its king was dying before its eyes, and somewhere, deep in the labyrinth of corridors, Charles coughed, crossed himself, and whispered the words that had become his only command. "Pray harder. The end must look like faith. Empires do not collapse in a single night. They dim, one candle at a time." By the 1690s, Spain still called itself great, but the world no longer believed it. The silver fleets from the Indies arrived late, or ruined, or not at all. Soldiers went unpaid. Castles crumbled. The people blamed taxes. The ministers blamed France. The priests blamed sin. Inside the palace, they blamed the king's body. "How can a kingdom be strong?" whispered one ambassador. when its king cannot lift a sword or a child. Foreign courts circled like wolves. Louis XIV of France watched from Versailles, already imagining his grandson on the Spanish throne. The Austrian Habsburgs too made their quiet claims. Everyone agreed on one thing. When Charles II died, Spain would be meat on the table, and Charles knew it. The bewitched kingdom, so weak he could barely climb stairs, understood with aching clarity that the fate of an empire sat inside a body that could not produce an heir. That is the most terrible knowledge a king can have. He prayed more. He fasted more. He ordered more relics brought to Madrid. He asked for the bones of saints, for water from the Jordan, for pieces of the true cross. He begged God for a miracle the way a child begs for a father. But God, or history, or blood, none of them answered. So the palace turned on itself. Two factions emerged, sharp as knives: the Austrian party, who wanted the crown to stay in the Habsburg blood, and the French party, who wanted to pass it to the Bourbons. The Queen, being Austrian, was suspected of pushing Vienna's claim. Spanish nobles hissed that she wanted to rule through a foreign prince. She denied it, but in courts, denial is only another flavor of confession. Charles sat in council, eyes sunken, lips dry, while men debated who would rule after him, as if he were already in his coffin. He coughed blood into a lace handkerchief. No one stopped talking. In private, he asked his confessor, "Does a king sin if his body fails his crown?" The priest said, "A king is only a steward of God's will." Charles whispered, "Then why did God give me no strength?" The exorcisms grew more desperate. One notorious ritual, recorded by more than one witness, had the king lying on the floor while the priest demanded the devil return what he had stolen from the royal loins of Spain. Charles wept. The Queen wept. The priest shouted. Nothing changed. In the villages, people began to say, "The king is not sick, Spain is. He only shows it." And they were right, for what is a dynasty that marries only itself? What is a church that blesses blood even when it chokes? What is an empire that cannot admit it is old? It is a house about to fall. At last the question could no longer be avoided. Who will inherit Spain? France said, "Our Bourbon prince." Austria said, "Our Habsburg archduke." Spain said nothing, because Spain did not have the strength to say no. Charles, the man called Bewitched, was finally asked to do the only thing he could still do. Sign. Sign away the future. Sign away the map. Decide which foreign king would sit on a Spanish throne. He delayed, not because he wanted power, but because he knew that the moment he named his heir, his life's purpose was over. The Queen urged him toward Austria. The French ambassador urged him toward France. Priests warned him that choosing wrong might damn his soul. Ill, feverish, half in visions, he signed in favor of France. It was the final act of a tired man, and it lit the fuse for the War of the Spanish. Succession, a war that would tear Europe apart just to decide who truly owned the corpse of the Spanish. Empire, that was the legacy. Left by the cursed boy of Madrid, not triumph, not conquest, but a question written in blood. What happens when a crown refuses to let new blood in? And the answer, standing in the echoing halls of the Alcazar, was simple. It dies quietly, beautifully, like a candle in a room no one visits anymore. In the final winter of his reign, Madrid seemed to hold its breath. The air itself felt brittle, as though the city knew it was guarding the last heartbeat of an empire. Charles rarely rose from bed. His skin was translucent, his lips blue, his pulse faint. The courtiers came in silence now, not to serve, but to witness. Every candle burned lower than it should. Every shadow stretched longer. He asked the confessor to bring him the relics once more. The bones of saints were laid at his side, a cross pressed into his hands that trembled so weakly he could not lift it. "I am dying," he whispered. The priest nodded. "All men die, Majesty." "But not all kingdoms," said the king. He asked that the room remain open to the light. He said he wanted to see Spain one last time. the sky that had watched his birth, the land his ancestors had ruled, the same sun that would rise again without him. The queen entered quietly, pale and exhausted, still young enough to live another life but too loyal to imagine one. She knelt beside the bed and wept without sound. Charles turned to her with that old fragile kindness that had never left him. "I have given you nothing," he said. "Not even a child to carry my name." She took his hand. "You have given me pity, Majesty. That is more human than love." Outside the window, bells tolled for evening mass. Inside, the dying king mouthed each prayer with effort. He asked that no one touch him when the end came. "I came into this world alone," he murmured, "and I will leave it without dragging anyone down." At dusk, the final light crossed his face, a gold thread slipping over ruined majesty. For a heartbeat, it almost made him beautiful again. Then he stopped breathing. The candle beside the bed flickered once and went out. When the doctors opened his body, they found what history already knew. His heart was small. His intestines were rotted. His lungs were black with water, and where his seed should have been, there was only dust. Spain buried him in the Escorial with full honors, bells, banners, processions, prayers. But beneath all that splendor, a chill truth lingered like smoke. The dynasty of Habsburg Spain had ended not with rebellion, not with war, but with a whisper and a prayer. And somewhere in the stillness of his tomb, the bewitched king, the last son of a cursed crown, was finally free of the blood that had owned him. The story of Charles II ends the way all curses do, not with thunder but with stillness. When the bewitched king closed his eyes, Spain itself seemed to stop breathing. The bells tolled as they always had, but even the sound felt tired. The empire that had devoured continents now knelt before an empty throne. His death was called peaceful, but peace is not what it was. It was surrender, the quiet confession of a nation that had been bleeding for centuries. In the crypt beneath the Escorial, the air is cool and perfect. Marble kings sleep shoulder to shoulder, their names carved deep into stone, their crowns sealed in shadow. Among them lies Charles, the child of too much prayer, too little mercy. They say no ghost haunts his tomb. Perhaps because his spirit, after so long trapped in a cage of blood and duty, finally escaped, and above that silent palace, the candle of the Habsburgs flickered once, and went out. For some stories do not end in ruin, they end in release, and when the wind moves through the corridors of Madrid at night, some swear they still hear a whisper, soft, trembling, half prayer, half warning. Do not let the blood forget to breathe.